Take it away.
So welcome. My name's Tatiana Morales, she, hers. I'm representing Tampa's People Protest and the People Safety Coalition. I'll let everyone introduce themselves in a second. And we're doing a presentation on the Military Industrial Complex Workshop. So if you're comfortable, introduce yourself with your name, pronouns, what organizations you're with, if any, and what you hope to learn and discuss during the session. And I'm really excited to just discuss the myriad of topics that come with the military and the U.S. military in specifics, and how we can address the issues at hand and where we can go with them. So I'll pass along to anyone else that wants to introduce themselves.
I'll go next. My name is Kieran, pronouns she, her, and I'm with the Restorative Justice Coalition, also People Safety Coalition. There's a lot to learn because a lot of times you think you know a lot of things and there's always something else to be uncovered, always new information to be found. So I'm definitely looking forward to that discussion.
I'm Angel D'Angelo, pronouns he, him. I'm also with Restorative Justice Coalition and People Safety Coalition. Part of doing these workshops, one of the advantages is I learned so much about the subject just by having to put together the research and then working with all of you. And I just wanted to shout out Jrotc, who also was a co-creator of this workshop and part of People Safety Coalition, but could not be here due to other obligations. So I just want to make sure I said that.
I'd be happy to introduce myself as Adrienne Sheeher. I'm with Veterans for Peace and served in the military. I've been doing peace and social justice activism since 2007. And started talking and learning about restorative justice a couple years ago and just really wanting to hear more. And I totally agree that learning never ends. It's important to remind ourselves that.
Perfect. Well, I'm excited to have everyone here and all the people that are here virtually as the internet kind of goes and content kind of goes and eternally. And so just a little bit about the People Safety Coalition. So the People Safety Coalition is a group of various grassroots organizations that will be listed at the end of the presentation that work toward the liberation of Black people, people of color, poor and working class people, immigrants, people of faith, LGBTQ+ people, disabled people, and incarcerated people. And we are founded with a radical and decarceral framework to disrupt and dismantle white supremacy, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism through an abolitionist lens. Our projects include political education, organizing community events, mutual aid, and city council watch, which is available on our YouTube channel under us and Tampa Bay Activist Network and the Restorative Justice Coalition. And so the norms and agreements. So we recommend that you don't speak over anyone else, allow people to finish before they're talking, and feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat. And this is a non-cancel, non-carceral, non-shaming space. We do not shame people for being what we perceive or know as wrong. Instead, we provide our perspective and facts and give everyone the opportunity to grow and learn. We understand all of us have varying degrees of societal privilege, and we imperfectly but intentionally keep that in mind as we navigate challenging conversations. So just a simple outline, we're going to start with lies about patriotism, recruiting practices, the economic and environmental impact of the military-industrial complex, and anti-war and anti-imperialism resources.
Alrighty, so I'll be taking over from here again. These are from Jrotc, who could not be with us tonight due to other obligations. So I will be presenting their part of the workshop here. So you see, the title is Lies About Patriotism. We're just going to do some overviews on that. So usually patriotism is viewed as a good thing and a value that every resident should have in their home country. But patriotism in the US specifically is inextricably tied to military violence in the forms of white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, racism, and environmental degradation. The US military-industrial complex carries out these forms of violence while hiding the atrocities and persuades the US residents to support the US military through propaganda. So institutions such as the government and the media shape our perception of domestic and global issues, and therefore identify binary groups into good guys and bad guys. So as we know, there's not a whole lot of in between or gray area when it comes to that theme. So authority. So one of the main reasons why the role and actions of the military go largely unquestioned is because of the role of authority. A lot of times we're taught not to question authority and to go along with it, especially the US military. And then there's other authority figures such as the police, a teacher, a parent, and even a doctor are believed excuse me, to have a specific set of knowledge and expertise to be qualified to carry out specific duties. If they face challengers, the general public often believes these challengers should be punished because they may have disobeyed the rules of society, or more specifically, the authority figure. So discipline and punishment is a tool that is often carried out in extreme measures in the structures of prisons and policing, the military industrial complex, the school system, and more as a means to control people, their behavior, and their bodies. And as you see, the source there is Discipline and Punishment by Michael Foucault. So propaganda. Most of the propaganda that we are familiar with are advertisements. Advertisements, especially posters, are a key factor in convincing people in the US for the need to not only go to war, but to recruit people to join the military as a means to fight for freedom or for the people in the US. So one of the most famous war propaganda posters is the Uncle Sam poster asking people to enlist. If you notice, we don't even need the image of it because you probably already know exactly what it is that we're speaking about. But there are several others that were used specifically during World War I and World War II. And there's a link there for further viewing at your leisure. So here's one of the posters as a demonstration as to how that propaganda works. So other posters like this one on the right encourage people in the US to help soldiers by making sacrifices, not using fuel and eating only certain foods because these resources were considered as essential to the US military. So such posters portray this as a civic duty that people in the US should uphold in order to support the troops and to win the war, engaging in them in the process and furthering the agenda of patriotism. So propaganda continued because, of course, there's a lot behind propaganda in the military industrial complex. So many people do not know this, but Hollywood has and currently plays a central role to spreading pro-war propaganda. Patriotism is not only a political ideal, but a cultural one as well. And the film industry shapes the current culture. The government funded and supported the film industry to develop war hero movies in order to sell the war and gain support for the military during the World War II and the Cold War era. These propaganda efforts not only advertise war, but they also label who the enemy is, for example, communism. And this I actually did not know until today, but the CIA secretly purchased the film rights of Animal Farm and subsequently turned the story into a propaganda project, entirely revising the ending so the pigs, who represent communist masters, were overthrown by the other animals on the farm. So that just kind of shows you how powerful images and movies and so on can shape perception. So the next one we'll look at is the enemy. So the US will always view marginalized groups, especially groups that have or will gain power, to become a threat to the status quo and therefore declare them as an enemy. The US vilifying countries cannot be separated from anti-communism efforts throughout the 1990s, and that still continued today. As a state actor, the US does not want to lose its spot in control of global hegemony and ignores the positive progression that other countries are succeeding in. Some instances include the constant demonization of Cuba and China while ignoring their success. For example, ignoring how China eliminated extreme poverty throughout the country. And here we have an example of how world politics review perpetuates the vilification of China and even justifies the US to take action, positioning the US as a policeman of the world. And if you remember very specifically, our prior administration very much leaned into demonizing China and stirring up those kinds of the other and the enemy. So by pointing the finger at who the enemy is, it allows the US to execute any actions they deem necessary in order to neutralize a threat, perpetuating neo-imperialism through squandering other countries' health, economies, and political stability in order for the US to remain on top of the world. Here's some examples of the US justifying its punishment of countries labeled as an enemy. So these are some headlines. It says the first one is, due to the rise of communism in Cuba, the US saw this as a threat and placed an embargo. The decades-long embargo on Cuba has not only hurt its economy, but also health outcomes, as it prevents Cuba from importing medicine, technology, and health supplies. And the next example is for China. The US views China as a threat with its communist state and increasing economy and technology, and its ministry called on the US to end its demonization of China. And here's that poster. I know that, like I said, we didn't even have to put the image up, but we can pretty much guarantee that that's what popped into your head when I mentioned that earlier.
Thank you, Kieran. And I just wanted to say hello to KD if you feel up to it, if you want to unmute and do a quick intro.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I was late.
It is A-okay. Glad you're here. Okay, so thank you for that, Kieran. The talk about patriotism is something that really just has always fascinated me, especially growing up, being in middle school when 9/11 happened, and I saw a lot of manufactured patriotism or people patriotic out of fear and things like that. So as you were talking, some of the stuff you talked about kind of lines in with some of the research I did about how the United States recruits to the military. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Why do we send the poor to fight the rich man's wars? Sometimes I wonder, what would society look like if rich people had to enlist their children into the wars? Would we see as much war? Why is it that we're always sending the poor to fight these wars? How does poverty existing as a system keep the military industrial complex alive? I constantly ask myself, if there was no poverty, would we have such a strong military? I did a lot of the research that you're about to see through this article from 2020, so it's not that old. The weaponization of poverty and investigation into US military recruitment practices in high schools of low-income communities. It is specific to what is known as the Inland Empire, which is apparently the name of a section of an area in California, I believe. But the information is relevant to what we see across the country. This was specifically studied because of its egregious class discrepancies in that area. So what is the Inland Empire? It's just east of Los Angeles. It is an area that has a high concentration of poverty in terms of labor. It has a growing employment in healthcare, as well as social assistance and education, which is providing plenty of jobs for the middle class workers, and of course is offering vital services to the public. However, there is a lot of economic insecurity due to low wages, layoffs, and erosion of employment benefits. As the labor market grows in different sectors for this middle class, economic insecurity is still prevalent for those in the public sector and those in the lower class. Using MIT's living wage standard based on household composition and cost of expenses, it's calculated that an Inland Empire family of 4 with 2 working adults, each parent must earn about 18 an hour. So that means 2 adults would have to make it at least $36K a year to make ends meet. That comes to about $72,000 annually just to survive in the Inland Empire. However, only 38% of the jobs in the Inland Empire meet this standard. So the likelihood of having 1 parent, let alone 2 parents, making at least $18 an hour is incredibly low in that area. So what are the statistics to this area which make it stand out and make it such a hotbed for military recruitment? For children age 18 and younger, more than 1 in 5 or 20% in Riverside County, and more than 1 in 4 or 25% in San Bernardino County live in poverty, compared to 19.9% in the state of California and the country's average of 19.5%. So 19.5% as the US average of poverty is already really too high because we are the wealthiest country in the nation. But then you're looking at the Inland Empire and it is above that amount. Of course, matching the national statistics, official poverty rates are amongst the highest among Native Americans, Black folks, and Latin folks, and we're higher among women than men. These trends can partially be explained by the wildly unproductive relationship between hourly income and housing costs, which Kieran, as you know, something we've talked about a lot lately, that disparity is Tampa, Florida, and it's getting worse in Tampa, Florida. It's actually getting even worse. So the Inland Empire is a great outlook into the system of poverty because of how heavily poverty is concentrated above the state and national averages in that area. Just for reference, Tampa, last I checked, I believe we are at 19% poverty ratio. So we are at the national average, but that was pre-pandemic statistics. So I'd be really interested to see how we come out of this and how this impacts military recruitment in Tampa. Okay, so we'll be talking about the budget a little bit more extensively later, but for now, let's talk about some of the budgetary changes that happened. As of fiscal year 2020, the military was allocated $738 billion in spending, an increase of $22 billion from 2019. So keep that in mind. As we're entering a global pandemic, $22 billion went to our United States military, while a lot of people in the United States lost their jobs, their house, and their security. As people struggle to pay for the housing throughout the US, more money goes into the military. According to Gold, the United States is the largest spender in military spending above any other country. So we're not, we are the most powerful country in the world based on the current standards now, but there are some countries that are close in power, like China. Kieran mentioned China a lot. That's a country we like to vilify. And we are not people that believe that China is a perfect utopia land either. But it's interesting how much we're willing to vilify it. But even they don't spend as much on their military. The second highest spender is at $237 billion. We're at $738 billion. That's a huge discrepancy. Recruitment in high schools. So I can recall the United States military having quite a big presence at Hillsborough High School when I went there. And as flippant as this may sound, I went to high school before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, so I didn't have to worry about it. I wasn't allowed to be in the military. But a lot of people I knew were very interested in this. One of my best friends, for example, was in the Jrotc program, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But according to the author, the ACLU states that there is actually no federal law that says the schools have to allow military recruiters on their campus. However, if a school allows any other recruiter, so if Walmart, Target, McDonald's, if they're allowed to have recruiters, that school must also allow military recruiters. So it's all or nothing. So if you don't want any recruitment at all, which doesn't sound like it would make sense in a school, then you don't have to have the military there. But if you allow any recruitment, you must have the military, you must allow them to be present. This means the only legal way, of course, would be to have no recruiting at all for any type of trade schools or skilled trades, anything. You couldn't do any of it. Just not really the way our society is set up, since schools are themselves what we would say indoctrination centers for the working class. So it's all about recruiting and getting workers anyway. So they're not going to take that away. Jrotc is a program that is a popular pipeline to military recruitment. The friend I referenced that was in Jrotc did eventually join the military. According to the official Army website, the Jrotc is one of the largest character development and citizenship programs for youth in the world that utilizes a 4-part model to motivate the cadet and allow the cadet to learn new information, practice competency, and apply the competency to a real life situation. JROTC is sold as a solution to parents, guardians, and teachers. It's an attractive program because it's sold as a program that can build community, discipline, and prepare students for the real world. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, in response to the Rodney King's uprising of 1992, stated that the solution to the problems of city youth, we know what city youth typically means, it's usually a dog whistle, problems of the city youth was the kind of discipline and structure offered by the US military. In the ensuing decade, the number of JROTC programs doubled, with over 500,000 students enrolled at over 3,000 schools coast to coast and a Pentagon budget allocation in excess of $250 million annually, just for the JROTC programs. Here is an image of some media you may be familiar with. The movie Hurt Locker. I was actually working at Mubico when that came out. Saving Private Ryan is a cult classic, I feel like. And Call of Duty. I've never played that game, but almost every, just to stereotype, almost every cis straight guy I know plays Call of Duty. Video game recruitment isn't a new thing. The US military found itself ahead of the curve and through the Pentagon have been sponsoring video game development since the early 2000s. So in the other part where we talked about Animal Farm, I've never seen that movie, but it doesn't shock me so much that the US military actually went and took this screenplay and said, let's make this something, because this is also something they do with video games. 2002, the first person shooter, America's Army, Tatiana. Tatiana also plays Call of Duty. In 2002, the first person shooter America's Army launched for Windows systems and acted as a brand new recruitment system, allowing players to explore the Army at their own pace. This is the earliest example of the US Army recruiting in the world of video games, but not the last attempt. The military watched as the gaming industry grew and grew and occasionally put up updated versions of the American Army's project. As of 2015, the Pentagon included electronic games in instruction 5410.16. So in one of their official documents, they talk about electronic games. This added video games to the list of varying media that would benefit military service recruiting and retention programs. Okay, esports is a program where active duty and reserves military personnel actively use gaming platform for recruitment purposes. The US Army esports team is broken into the following divisions: Call of Duty, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Fortnite, another name, a game I hear mentioned a lot. I stopped playing after, Super Mario Bros. 64. I don't know video games after that, so. Overwatch, and Magic the Gathering. That kind of shocked me when I saw Magic the Gathering on there. Isn't that one of those card games, like Pokemon thing? By accessing some of the most popular esports games on the web, it has direct access to thousands of gamers of all ages who could be valued recruits for the US Armed Services. It's about how this makes people feel. We talked about patriotism earlier. So all that leads to, it's easy to understand how people consuming this type of media will feel a great sense of admiration for those on screen. We watch a movie like Saving Private Ryan or any of these other, The Emperor or whatever war-based movie it is. And it's just like, it's so glamorous. It seems so cool to be this person with all this equipment and this high-tech gear. Stories of adventure and excitement entice adolescents, and it's quite routine to describe the military in an oversimplistic manner, which then glorifies dangerous activities. It appears that the military is heavily reliant on recruits seeing service as an opportunity to become a better version of themselves, while also enjoying life in the process. Military is essentially presented as low risk, but a highly structured program to help one grow as a person through the acquisition of socioeconomic assets to which they may not have otherwise had opportunity to access. So it's presented as low risk, high reward. Its recruitment styles is not much different from gangs. It's not much different from religion. In the study I reviewed, military recruiting in high schools has been a mainstay of the so-called all volunteer armed forces from the start. Kids in high school at an age where being a member of an identifiable group with a grand mission beyond themselves and a shared spirit, and of course a distinctive uniform, is of exaggerated importance. Something gang recruiters in big cities also notice, use, and exploit. The latter parts of Ayer's words in this study hits home on the sentiment shared by other researchers who further assess students with militaristic obedience to authority and who have been socialized to accept dominant perspectives about the reasons for war and military actions are prepared to fight these ongoing imperial wars of this nation. It is easy to see how a culture of respecting a power greater than oneself remains prominent in a country where nearly 80% of citizens identify as religious. Where the military expands beyond the simple principles of religion is its capacity to boost one's self-image and social capital through commitment to a higher power. So this is why I look at patriotism and religion as sort of similar systems. I was raised Catholic, for example, and questioning the Bible was not allowed. Questioning the United States government, the flag, the military, not allowed. So as long as we're not allowed to question it, like Kieran said earlier, if we can't question it, then we can't learn the other perspectives. We only maintain that dominant perspective, which is part of the reason why we chose Veterans Day as a day to have this conversation. Targeting the poor is perfectly intentional. Schools with kids from wealthier families and a higher percentage of what is known as college down students are not viewed as good prospects by military recruiters. It's as if those schools had posted signs at the entrances saying, don't bother. Of course, they didn't post that because remember earlier, if any recruiter is allowed in, then the military is allowed in. They just don't go. The kids in these schools are not the kids who fight America's wars. Additional research tends to support the claim, including suggesting that young adults with college aspirations trend towards having significantly lower interest in military service. Young adults from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and from northern urban areas may have the lowest interest levels of any high school demographic. So when I was pondering, why don't we send rich kids off to wars? There doesn't seem to be much interest for that from the children themselves, and there doesn't seem to be much of a necessity. Since college-bound students will already sell their labor to big corporations for a salary, they will serve the internal capitalistic class's interests domestically, or they'll become the internal capitalistic class. The poor will be best defending the imperial nation through the means of war. So it all goes back to our labor. No child left behind from war. So if you were around during 9/11, you may remember No Child Left Behind, President Bush, all these talks about testing. I remember our schools had to change the way they did tests and all that, you know, the FCAT, all that good stuff that was going on at that time. No Child Left Behind was sold as a program protecting low-funded schools and providing resources for students in the low-income areas. This post-9/11 program served much greater purposes, though. The passage of No Child Left Behind in 2002 served as part of a broader strategy by the Pentagon to recruit low-income urban youth for the military. It was argued that the Bush-era education overhaul's focus on standardized tests and punitive sanctions reinforced the already limited curriculum for high schools in low-income communities, leading to the diminished capacity of students to question militarism and challenge social oppression. So in other words, they made it harder for you to be educated, to think critically, to even question militarism of the United States military. And when I read this, I'm like, things are starting to make a little bit more sense as to where we are right now. And as to why so many things go on unquestioned. Why do people join the US military anyway? Of course, there's a number of reasons. Indeed.com, the career resource, listed several. Paying for college, medical benefits, and housing and stipends and loans are some of those reasons. With this, we have to question, does this mean programs like free college, Medicare for all, and housing as an inalienable right, would that threaten military recruitment? I'd say so. If these three reasons were high enough to be on Indeed's list, then they're probably eliminating those barriers would probably cause a reduction in military enrollment. Obviously, it's also important to think, this came to my mind. When my grandfather was 20, he was drafted. He was forced, conscribed into the United States military. That was the norm of that day. They could force you into it. Now they don't have to force you into it because they've created systems that will force you into it. So that's something to think about, because we look at how the economy has changed. Housing was a little bit better in the 50s, at least for some demographics. Now it's really bad. So how do they manage to maintain, they're like in the draft. Yeah, so they decided to end the draft, but they left out that fine print that's like, okay, but we'll make everybody so flipping miserable that they'll still join the military. So that's something to think about. There's always a price tag to anything we get. Until abolition, there will always be a price tag. If we want to get something, we've got to give something. When asked what the reason was most applicable and influence a participant to join the armed forces, 56% did state it was because of patriotism. So 56% did it because in their hearts, they feel it's the right thing to do. And that's part of that indoctrination. However, the second highest reason was benefits. That's a good number. 24% of people aren't feeling very patriotic, but we're like, I need these benefits. It's also important to understand about social desirability when filling out surveys. So even though they're anonymous, and even though people, their individual answers can't be identified, people still feel pressured to answer the way that they feel someone would want them to answer. So although it's 56% stating patriotism, that number is probably actually a little bit lower. And it also is possible that someone is feeling patriotic or convincing themselves they're patriotic because they don't want to admit the reason they're doing it is because they need healthcare. From the sample, we also saw other things: acceptance, job promotion. Other was 17%. In the other, family connections and expectations was a reason for joining. I think about that a lot in people that have military families. They join the military because grandpa did or dad did, or I was a military brat, it's what I know, and things like that. In the sample, when they looked at benefits, paid education was the primary benefit that influenced people to join, that were interested in benefits, retirement being the second highest benefit. Another thing that's gone away, so in the 50s, when you worked for GTE or you worked for the bank or whatever, you got a pension if you worked 20, 30 years. You had what we know as retirement. That has changed. We don't really have that in the private sector so much anymore. So if you want to retire and you're in the private sector, the military may be one of the only options for you to transfer to. Healthcare was the third highest ranking benefit. As you know, the military does have sort of a version of what might look like a universal healthcare program to some extent. I know there's a lot of problems with the VA, but some people I know, even those who have since become sort of anti-military themselves, still talk about, at least I have the VA. Like, at least I can still go to the VA. If I wasn't a veteran, I wouldn't have healthcare at all. Imagine if we spent all this money recruiting the poor, we actually spend it on supporting the people who have already served. Exactly. Like, imagine if we actually were helping the people that have already served and have gone through this. Speaking of that, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Today's Veterans Day. And we're supposed to be supporting our troops, but do we really do that very well? Although there has been some progress in ending veteran homelessness overall, of course, racial disparities must exist. 43.2% of veterans who are houseless are veterans of color, compared to the 18.4%, which is the total. That is a gross overrepresentation. 33.1% of veterans experiencing houselessness are Black, compared to 12.3% of the general veteran population. 3% of houseless veterans are Native American, and 4.8% would be identified as multiracial. Again, another disparity. White veterans are significantly less likely to be houseless. 56.8% of veterans experiencing houselessness are white, compared with the more than 81.6% of the general veteran population. So 81.6% of veterans are white, only 56.8% of those are houseless, which is still like only, oh my gosh, that's still like a lot, but the representations are very off here. Veterans do have a lower poverty rate than the average American, 6.9% versus 14.4% in 2012. But still, 1.5 million veterans live in poverty. If we were really this patriotic country that supported our troops, you'd think that number would be a lot closer to zero. The veteran poverty rate for vets between 18 and 34 is higher than all other age groups. This means that veterans of the Gulf War and Afghanistan War have higher poverty rates than other veterans. So it seems like a lot has changed since World War II. We welcomed home veterans and we said, welcome home, but then we didn't actually have a home for them to go to. And that's kind of scary. Veterans use food stamps in larger numbers than ever before. Another thing that's just kind of like, oh my gosh, why would you ever think that would be a necessity? The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, has seen an unprecedented rise in usage over the last 6 years. And veterans have been applying for these programs to meet almost 1 million households with veterans are on food stamps. With so many veterans in poverty, what is Veterans Day really about? The US only supports our troops in theory, but when it comes to actual resources, it makes you question, is Veterans Day really about honoring these people, or could it be a feel-good moment to encourage more recruitment in the form of pageantry and decoration? Just a few quick facts about Veterans Day. It occurs on November 11th every year in the US in honor of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, which is when World War I ended, known as Armistice Day. In 54, President Eisenhower changed it to Veterans Day. In 68, the Uniform Holidays Bill was passed by Congress, which moved the celebration of Veterans Day to the fourth Monday in October. The law went into effect in 71, but in 75, President Ford returned it back to November 11th due to the historical significance of the day. Veterans Day commemorates veterans of all wars. Armistice Day, the original day, actually had a very different meaning, which I thought was very interesting. Following World War I, up until then, the bloodiest and most destructive war in the history of humankind, many of the belligerent nations resolved, at least temporarily, that such devastation and tragic loss of life must never happen again. On June 4th of 26, Congress passed a concurrent resolution establishing November 11th, the day when the fighting stopped, as Armistice Day, a legal holiday, the intent and purpose of which we would commemorate with Thanksgiving and prayer and exercises designed to perpetuate peace through goodwill and mutual understanding between nations. Now, that's not how we look at Veterans Day today. We're not talking about peace between nations. In accordance with the resolution, President Coolidge issued a proclamation on November 3rd, 26, inviting the people of the United States to observe the day in schools and churches or other places with appropriate ceremonies expressive of our gratitude for peace and our desire for the continuance of friendly relations with all other peoples. Wouldn't that be a lovely thing to celebrate today? Wouldn't that be really honoring people who went through this hell? It's important to know that in World War I, the United States was not the dominant superpower yet. We didn't really get that status until after World War II. We were getting there, we were building it, but our culture has really changed a lot since we have become this, quote, superpower. Awesome. Veterans for Peace has a Reclaim Armistice Day campaign just for these reasons, and that will be something exciting to look into. Oops. Okay, let me go back. Sorry, y'all. And that is that about recruiting. And now we're going to go into the budget, Tatiana.
Yeah. So, I really wanted to start and talk about the economic and environmental impact of the military industrial complex. And with that, just add like a small asterisk of like, the conversation that we're having today is one that we could have for truly 30 years. Like keep talking and talking about the depth and the span. And we're not even talking about the human cost of war, the damage of vets that don't even get this type of support, the way that the military has been subcontracted into an abyss. Like just the large scale of this problem is something that we truly can't reduce. And it's something that this conversation is just a part of conversations that can really expand in so many ways, but it's so important to have. And so these are just topics that we all felt were particularly pertinent for the lens we're approaching this as. So I just wanted to like clarify that and say that because it's something I was thinking about. So I use a lot of like visual satire because I think there's so much that's so great, especially when we look at the budget and looking at the fun stuff like numbers. And I'm going to specifically talk about Afghanistan since it's the most recent war we've ended. And it's one of the most costly wars we've ever been in. Just by insane numbers. So really for Afghanistan, the total is for over 20-year war, this war that has cost so many lives in so many ways and has not left Afghanistan in anywhere near of a better place has actually reverted them back to the control of the Taliban, has cost us over $2.25 trillion. And there's really psychological studies that show how much humans just can't comprehend this like scope of large numbers and money. But $2.5 trillion, in a way to break it down, is $300 million per day for 2 decades. And that is just such an overwhelming amount of money that when we have conversations about the current thing, like the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill right now that is having conversations about how much it could be, like these infrastructure bills are just pennies on the dime of how much we've spent on this in one singular war, not encompassing all the over 800 military sites we have over the world in 80 countries. There is so much money that we've spent into this war. And so part of it has gone to $933 billion for overseas contingency operations for the Department of Defense, which used to actually be called the Department of War, and we changed it for a more, what I assume and believe and what I just know is that we've changed the title to have a more representative name for what we are trying to do. But a lot of what we do across the world isn't defense. It's incredibly offensive. It's incredibly political and incredibly targeted for either resource extraction, either political, geopolitical targeting, either toppling leaders in places like Panama or Chile, and really a lot more than just defense. And so we've also spent $530 billion in interest payments. And these are the interest payments we have now, not the entire interest that is going to come for over the 2.25 trillion, which will probably put the number for Afghanistan into over $7 trillion. So just imagining this like large expanse of money that is something that we as taxpayers are going to keep paying into. And so we've done over another 443 billion extra that went to the Department of Defense. And then 296 billion went to veterans, medical, and disability. And that is just a number up until now. And that number seems high, but when we look at the 2.25 trillion that went for an entire war and think, why is only such a small number has actually gone to help the veterans that are now dealing with some of the greatest ramifications of just being at war, setting up for war, being out there, training, the damage that can come from friendly fire, from just the consequences of a location and things like that. And we're not even talking about the effect of the veterans that are at home, that are here, that are homeless, that have no access to resources, that are struggling to even get the mental health care that they need desperately, that we don't even address as care. So, and looking at that number of like 296 billion, and it's bought us this infrastructure that has not served the people that have actually served, that has not actually created structures that help them get training and support once they're out of the military, once they've gone into back to civilian life, and thinking about like, what could we actually do? And then on top of that, another 59 billion went toward the State Department of War budget. And thinking about that cost of war, that large number, that $2.25 trillion, over 30 of the world's wealthiest, including Bezos, Bill Gates, all of Elon Musk, like all these people, we still spent way more on war than the money that these people have, if you want an even larger expanse to understanding how much we've costed at war. So yeah, next slide, please. And so in examining the budget and really looking at that, like when we talk about how we get to these numbers, how we get to this, it is an incredibly complex system that has shifted a lot throughout US history. It's something that works through congressional approvals, through subcommittees, through contracts we make with subcontractors. We signed contracts with subcontractors once we took the first people out of Afghanistan, just continuing to stay there because we've already signed contracts with them, because we're so beheld by these large warmongers that own these corporations that fund the wars that we're in. So in looking at it and we think about how we approach it, it is one that is going to be, it's a grand approach. We have to approach it at every level, at how our congressional leaders that approve it and how they approve that in their meetings, in their offices, in their day-to-day actions, how much this money goes and how much the expansion of it is. And also locally, when we talk about recruitment in schools and all these different processes and how we actually spend money in that level of just going to school, setting up tables and not actually supporting people in those communities that are signing up because they're too poor to do anything else. And that's not bad. It doesn't matter why you went in. It's the fact that you should be supported throughout and afterwards, and actually be promising the ideals that you went in for, and not going to work as a subcontractor for a defense agency in Iraq, and doing actual things that may help these communities that we're in, instead of the rampant conflict and just violence that is faced in every level when that's not what people went in to do. So anyways, in talking about this and really talking about like, is it worth the cost? And when we think about worth, it's not just the value of the human lives that we've lost to war, which is almost uncalculable at this point by all the wars that we've been in, just the immense amount of human loss that we've gained, that we've lost, but also the fact that the people that are still losing, the people that have came back, that went out, that stood next to a burn pit, and now their lungs and insides are completely falling apart because of their access to the chemicals that were just in the air when just human waste and supplies needed to be destroyed. So there is such a large cost that is so beyond what we've done. And I really want to think about that numbers of the 2.7 trillion and think about what it can be done. And I thought about a couple examples, and I want you guys to think about a couple examples about what we can actually do with $2.7 trillion. And even the larger number of like $7 trillion of what might be the total cost of Afghanistan and all the fees that will come with it. So I thought about things like universal healthcare. The best example, there are about 4 large-scale models of universal healthcare that have been proposed in congressional approvals of what would be the largest, most encompassing version of universal healthcare in the US. Over $1.5 trillion is the difference between the war and the most expensive option, the option that gets the best care for everyone, the highest quality standards above every other comparable OECD nation, that it's still $1.5 trillion less. So think about how much money that is that we've spent in war, that we could have spent in investing in healthcare and supplies, in mental health care, and just truly changing our country's absolutely horrible standard of medical care. And I also thought about things like housing for all. The best study that has shown how we would house every single person in this country, $20 billion would absolutely end housing insecurity, would house every single person in the United States. One investment of $20 billion. And think about how our federal government spends $3 billion a year. And we are still in a growing housing crisis all over the country. Homelessness has drastically increased throughout the pandemic and is still increasing. We're local to Tampa. I can tell from my street alone that the populations around me have quadrupled because of this crisis, and it's still getting worse. So when we think about how 20 billion, that massive number to us lay people that have only hundreds in our bank accounts, and going to the extent of $20 billion that could absolutely end housing insecurity. And just thinking about what else we could do. So in the chat, I saw a couple of amazing suggestions. So really things like addressing the climate crisis, which I will get to. We can actually have better infrastructure. I know I've been all over the US and I have seen streets that are abysmal. My family comes from the Dominican Republic, which is considered a third world nation. And I've seen better streets in DR. And it's something that blows my mind when I travel back and forth saying like, oh, they're doing massive investments in infrastructure in a country that has such a small comparable population, small GDP compared to the US, and thinking about how we could actually doing better things than the US is doing for its own people. And I really think about when we look at these massive numbers and these things that are so heavily contested and argued about all over the world in our politicians and our debates, they're like, oh, how do we fix America? We don't have enough money. We have enough money. We spend it in these wars, filling up the buckets of these warmongers every day instead of actually helping those people that are struggling, that need that have served, that haven't served, that are just struggling, that need help. And so things like universal basic income, free higher education, investing in educators, rebuilding national infrastructure. There was an estimate to how much national high-speed rail, like covering the entire US, going across the entire country, would be. It'd be 2.63 trillion. And so 2.63 trillion is right around the amount we spent. That would cover the entire country, the United States is massive, filling it with high-tech, high-speed rail that other countries like China did over 30 years ago. Things that they invested that have drastically changed their quality of life, that have drastically improved it. Yeah, universal child care is something incredibly, federal jobs guarantee, something that we should already do to our veterans that come out with these promises. A lot of the promises going into war are the sense of a jobs guarantee. It's somewhere where you get paid, you will get supported. And a lot of times since you leave, you're out on your own. You do not have that support that has been promised to you, that was advertised to you. And I really think when we're looking at this money and the cost and how much the Pentagon budget alone grows by 6.5% a year to spend $60 billion per month. And this year's budget for the US military looks about $704 million that is predominantly going to private contractors. Like, even if we cut our defense budget in half, we'd be spending over $100 billion in China and Russia and all these other countries that are even nearby us. So really thinking about this money in these numbers and really processing that the money we've spent, the things that we have already done, we cannot take back. We can make better choices for the future in how we invest this money and how we change our societies, and demand that when we look at the military, we look at the people we've hurt, the people that we've already damaged, the countries we've infiltrated, and see how can we actually help so we don't end up in these larger scale wars, and look at it from just a better perspective and a smarter perspective, looking at the history and where we're at, and not just funneling down these same paths that lead us nowhere and cost us so much. So that was a lot, because the money is a big topic and it is a lot. So I wanted to switch with a little bit more of switch to the next slide and go to a little bit more graphics about just like examples of. So one of the graphics that really, like, this one stopped me and made me think about this, the one that says pretend I'm Afghanistan and keep throwing money in the hole. And it's the example of a homeless veteran, and thinking, what if we could actually invest in the humans that have lost their lives, that are here in the streets. I know veterans that I go help do mutual aid for that are struggling, that have served so much, that have done so much and have nothing, and could maybe $1,000, $2,000 could absolutely change their life, that are stuck in debts because of their mental illness, that are stuck in debts because of housing and all these other social problems, and really thinking, how could we invest this money, and how our taxpayer money has not done things to actually help the people that we promised it would. That has actually gone to the pockets of these incredibly wealthy monsters that will do this to keep draining us. And that's why we have to change our approach. So next slide. And so who are they fighting for? Who are our military vets going out there? Who are treats actually fighting for? And when we have this rotating villain, that's China, that's Russia, that's communism, that's socialism, that's all these things, we have to actually take into account and see that just spreading this death and destruction will not get us anywhere. It is a cycle that will absolutely not get us anywhere. And we have to actually take the hard looks at ourselves and see, what do we do next? And what's happened is we have over 800 military bases in 80 countries that are not counting black sites like Guantanamo and other places that are semi-legal centers that we have all over the world, that we house people, that we spend so much money that we cannot even find out how much we spend in Guantanamo because of the legalities that we've put into place. And really addressing, is this worth it? Is spreading this political ideology under like democracy or fascism, as governments have done and these leaders have taken advantage of us, worth it? And it's not. It's not. It's not. The damage that has been done needs to be changed, and we need to address it. And looking at these bases, looking at this rotating villain, we need to actually address the lies of patriotism, the things that have been said and spread to us by using truth and the information and seeing how we can change it. So next slide. So I also wanted to talk about the local and international effects of militarization, but that's a slight tangent, because I think a lot of people don't understand how it connects to them and how it connects globally. And one of the biggest things is how this permanent war machine that we've built and have just grown and grown and grown needs to be ended. We need to start cutting things at ties. We need to talk about how when the ways that we've already demilitarized, the ways that we've had under Obama era policies, where the military was sending a lot of its equipment that was being used internationally into local militaries. I saw personally with my own two eyes, LRAD machines. I saw tanks on our streets through Black Lives Matter protests that were bought off from our police departments, that were bought from local police, that were bought from the military given to local police. And that happens internationally all the time. A lot of times troops will be put into hard situations where someone above them, a supervisor, is working with either a gang, a terrorist group, a drug trade in another country, and is selling illegal weapons into their trade because they were trying to either survive their situation there or find a connecting with the people. And these processes, we end up with these incredibly over militarized local police that are incredibly under accounted for and incredibly dangerous. And we don't actually address how far all of this reaches and how just nationally and locally it reaches. It's not even police departments, it's universities, it's private defense contractors that have, like one of the legislatures in North Carolina had a private defense company to follow her around when there was major power and infrastructure loss. And that was at taxpayer expense. That was bought up by equipment that was bought for private defense that is taken from our military. And I think sometimes we have to really look at the larger picture of how this really does bleed into all of our communities, locally in Tampa, internationally in Malaysia, and places like that, and really think about how the ugly side of these things. There's a project in Los Angeles called the Google LASD Gangs Project, where they were finding out that they were incredibly militarized rogue gangs functioning out of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Departments, where a lot of the equipment was bought out from military sales. And when we have to think, we have to end these processes that have been presented before and not let this happen. We can't have tanks and bombs and all these things that are considered like war crimes in our backyards. It only makes the problem worse. And that was the tangent I wanted to go on with local and international effects. And so as we switch to climate change, which is the next slide, and really looking at what the US military emits on a climate level. So the US military is the world's largest emitter by far. By all the countries comparable, the US military does millions and millions and millions of tons of just carbon dioxide emissions, just by the fuel, just by getting to locations, just by getting people across the world. The amount of damage we do to our country just by CO2, I think is worth its own slide alone, just to look at countries like Morocco, Peru, that are mass populations, that are countries that have had millions of years of history, that are not emitting as much as the US military. And that's why this is the target that we have to address. Because when we're looking at that 1.5 degree goal to not have major catastrophic climate change hitting all of our countries, we have to address the damage that the US military does. So next slide. And so no matter what we do locally and internationally, the hazard of war and how the military-industrial crisis has impacted the climate and has already done damage needs to be addressed going forward. With the rate of climate change and the level of damage that is done, we have to stop this machine of war and policing that we've done. We have to actually address it and curb the damage, because that amount of tons of war and the machine we've created is waiting to create the next war. The reason they are doing propaganda through video games, through TV, through movies, is that the war machine continues on when we are even not at war. There are people still at high schools, even through COVID. There are things that are still moving, and there's war that is going to come. And when we look at the wars that are coming, they're going to be resource wars. They're going to be brutal, they're going to be deadly, and they're going to be horrible. And we need to actually talk about what those wars look going forward and how we address them and how we actually change them as people in our communities, and how we prepare for what's coming and work as a community and a global community to go forward. Because we can't just look at the world through our small national lenses. We have to look at the entire world. If anything, a small virus from Wuhan can have some big damage everywhere else. And we have to look at that going forward. And we have to look at the military's role in creating damage and what we've done to our environment that protects us and houses us and keeps us alive. So the next slide, which is I consider the much more optimistic side. When times are tough, what do? We adapt. We have to demand demilitarization because our survival truly will depend on it. The global net human caused emissions of CO2 from 2010 to 2030 need to fall 45%. That's everyone on the planet, from the people in tribes that have never connected to us to me that has a lot of electronic devices and drives a car. We all need to address all of these issues. And that hasn't. We're in 2021. We've got 9 years to drop a lot of these very drastic changes onto the world. And I think a lot of that can come by impacting the damage that we've done and what we can do to change it. Because $2.7 trillion is a big number that we can still use and continue to use and demand from our governments to change that, to invest in climate infrastructure, to work as a global society to save the collective society. And in these water wars, there have already been wars fought in places like South Africa, where people's movements have actually stood up to water being taken away from lack of resource. And they demanded that every single resident got access to clean water, and they're making drastic changes. And these are small countries like South Africa. Now, what could the biggest, most industrialized country in the world do? I think 2.7 trillion could do a lot. And that's why I want to really get all these ideas and push forward and just push the idea that we need to demand better and demand more. So thank you for listening to me rant and rumble about a lot of numbers. And now I'm gonna pass it over to Karen to end us out.
All righty, so as we see here, we have 2 links, and the reason why it's 2 is because they're actually very, very extensive. And so some resources, especially I do want to focus on the Code Pink resource, So some of you may be familiar with Code Pink. They are very much a well-established anti-war organization. So if you go to their campaigns and their issues, they have a lot of just further resources and ways to get involved with many of the topics that we touched on, for example, like China not being our enemy, how to divest from the war machine. So that covers our issues about like the budget and the money spent. So these are just two links for everyone to check out in terms of how to get more involved to try to divest ourselves from this complex.
Thank you for those resources. And of course, now we know about Veterans for Peace. So that will be a resource that we will even, for non-veterans to look at. Because I'm sure all of you are aware veterans are often the scapegoat to these conversations. So since we have a little bit of time before the discussion points, when Kieran was presenting on patriotism, I can recall when I started questioning why I do the Pledge of Allegiance in high school. I knew this would have been just after 9/11. So there was absolutely no getting away with being anything less than patriotic at the time. So I would just kind of stand up and move my mouth, but I wouldn't actually say it because I was like, I don't understand why I'm saying this. Like, I don't know what any of this has to do with anything. What am I pledging allegiance to? That would kind of carry on to the point now where, I don't stand for the pledge or the national anthem now. It's not what I believe in. And I was at Plant City Council one year. We were advocating for police accountability over there. And they started their city council meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance, as they always do. I don't disrupt it. I just stayed seated. Some guy behind me was so offended by that, just by the sight of it. And he screamed a profanity at me and kneed me in the back, like physically assaulted me because I did not stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Naturally, the response to all that typically is, you're disrespecting our veterans, our flag. So many people died for your rights. They're fighting for your freedom. And how did my freedom get over into the Middle East? They have to fight over there for it. But I'll never forget that as long as I live, that I actually still have somewhat, and Kieran knows, I have some anxiety about it because every time I stand down for it, which I always will, I'm like, is this the day that somebody takes it even further? Is this the day that it's more of a violent attack? So I actually sometimes plan around events to make sure I arrive after the national anthem or the Pledge of Allegiance would begin. So that's just something that I really thought about when you were talking about patriotism. But we do have some discussion questions here if folks want to chime in. What are some resources that we could use to help those who are our current troops and veterans? And while the wheels are turning, one thing that I think about is I work in recruitment, and I have for a number of years. And when I was working for a staffing company, I would network with different agencies that help underserved populations, of course, veterans being one. And when I worked there, I didn't quite have the understanding of the politics I have today. So I was surprised at that time to learn how many mainstream employers out there don't hire veterans. Even though it's illegal to turn away employment based on veteran status. If you can't prove that's why you got turned away, and it's just like, it's illegal to discriminate against on race, but we know that still happens. All these things still happen. It's just, they can't flat out say it. I remember that was probably one of the first things that started having me interrogate the support our troops mantras. Because how can we have that belief, but then when we're sitting there at our jobs in HR and in recruiting, we look at someone's military background, you would think if we supported our troops and really believed in the military serving the way the Jrotc says it does, that people in the military would actually be the first people we hire, but they're often not. So employment, access to UBI, job guarantees like Tatiana mentioned are some resources I think about.
Yeah, one of the things that I found incredibly interesting was specifically like there are a lot of veterans groups out there and a lot of like association of veterans groups that already exist. And something that I've realized through my own like personal experience is that a lot of the groups really do a lot of great work advocating for their needs and what they want post serving. And a lot of times those groups are incredibly local, do a lot of great work, and they're trying to find housing for specific members. And a lot of times when you research, they're out there. They're always out there. They're always good resources. I know when I lived back in Miami that there was a group that worked with me and my mom when I would go with her to visit veterans that didn't have access to mental health care. This is now over 10 years ago, but they would pay for like over a year of mental health care for different people because they were people that didn't have the access to the extensive care that they needed that wasn't covered, like day to day and in and out inpatient treatments. And so there are things like that that can be advocated for very locally that communities can pay for, and things that can be done locally that can be very effective.
And I think for me, you know, when we talk about that, we talk about things like the VA and job guarantees. I mean, if we just had our society set up that way for everybody, then it wouldn't matter if you went, you know, to war or not. And as we saw from the recruitment slides, probably less people would go. I mean, I think there would still always be some people that, you know, were into it for whatever reasons that may come about. But one of the things that for the what did you learn question, even though I was part of the workshop, it shocked me when Jrotc found the Animal Farm thing about that movie. And I don't know why it shocked me, because that shouldn't be that surprising. It's pretty on brand. But I also think about movies and, you know, People Safety Coalition's primary work is defund the police, refund the community. But we can't have that conversation if we're not talking about the military. There are obviously so many similarities. I remember watching the movie, I think it was Zootopia. Yeah, Zootopia. And that was like total propaganda. The entire movie was about like policing and post-racial society and, you know, let's learn about our different, like all that. It was total propaganda. It was a fun movie. I enjoyed it. Like I criticize stuff all the time. I enjoy it. Like I'm not ragging on you for playing Call of Duty, right? Like if you play it, cool. But analyze what we're looking at. A lot of movies and TV shows and films feed us lines about policing and military and doctors and lawyers. Like look at Law and Order, for example. Law and Order tells you that these cops go out there, they fight the bad guys. In fact, in Law and Order as a show, this is a separate tangent, so I won't keep it long. A lot of times in the show, we watch cops violate the law, violate people's rights to get to the answer. And we applaud it because they're the good guy, because we know that, because we're watching the show, right? So we know they're the good guy. We shouldn't be applauding that. Even if it's the person who did the absolute quote worst thing in the world, we should want them to be accountable to the rules. Same kind of thing with the military. We like to give little perks. We'll give a discount here at the store, a little discounted ticket at the movie. I mean, I saw a guy, my old employer, they had a tow away policy overnight. So they towed away these people's cars. Turned out that they happened to be veterans. Of course, how would the management have known that? But because they were veterans, the company was like, oh my God, we're so sorry. We're going to reimburse and we're going to get you your groceries for free for that. It's lip service. So that way people feel good about having been military or feel like sort of like a duty owed to them. But we're not actually taking care of any of the systemic issues. And I wanted to elevate in the comment in the chat here from Adrienne, a lot of veterans don't even think of themselves as veterans, women in particular. Especially historically and today. So they don't even try to get benefits they'd be eligible for. And plus veterans shouldn't have to worry about their spouse, kids, etc., not having access to healthcare. You know, I didn't know that if you were a spouse, you didn't get those benefits.
Can you expand on that, Adrienne? I'm curious, as like when you say that they don't think of themselves as veterans, like do you mean like they don't, like, can you maybe expand on that? Help me understand that a little more. Like they don't think of themselves as having served in the military, or?
Yeah, so when people think about what it means to be a veteran, it's a very loaded term. And so when you look at the movies, it's people who have gone and served in war, and it's typically men who have served in combat. And like that's a stereotypical veteran. So a lot of women who served in the Army, Nurse Corps, or different support services. I worked in the VA for a number of years after I got out of the military, and constantly would encounter women who had served in one way or another, but because they hadn't served in a combat position or deployed a certain way, they wouldn't think of themselves as veterans. Even women who had served as nurses in, you know, overseas, Vietnam, whatever, they would think of themselves as having been a nurse, not even if they were in the, the military. But I mean, when I got out, because I served stateside, I didn't think of myself as a veteran. So that's another thing. If you didn't deploy, people just, they don't really think of themselves that way. And especially when you join at 17 and you get out at 23, what 23-year-old thinks of themselves as a veteran? This was, I mean, I got out just before it started hitting the fan with the hero worship of troops, which is totally, I mean, you should look at some of the stuff they did to erase the anti-war bloc of America to get them to support the invasion of Iraq in the 90s. Like all of the military families, like there were all these news reports about families and support the troops and people, being here in the States and tie a yellow ribbon. And so much of it was propaganda that was just designed to get people to embrace this idea that you can't question war, you have to support the troops. I mean, I remember that as a kid before I decided to join the military. So at any rate, and you don't get, spouses and kids don't get access to anything unless a veteran is 100% service connected. And then they might get some access to healthcare and some education support, but it's very difficult to get 100% service connected. It's not guaranteed.
Thank you for that. Well, and I do remember the yellow ribbons. I really do. I remember, and it evokes such an emotion, even in myself, even as someone who's doing this activism. I've been into anti-imperialism work for a number of years. I still have a really hard time with it because I've been indoctrinated so long. And then also, and I understand varying opinions on it, especially depending on your positionality in society. Like if you are someone from a country that has been attacked by the United States, I get not having any room for that nuance or empathy for veterans. In that case, I get that. But because I'm here on this side, I really don't like when fellow USDNs who also benefit from the privilege of being in this, imperial world, have this idea about trying to get the best hot take, be the most radical, and like really put down every person that's ever been in the United States military. And I often have to ask them, well, where do you draw the line on ethics? Because yes, they're just following orders, and then they get you with the, oh, well, so was the Third Reich. Well, okay, well, so is the employee at Aetna that's denying your insulin. Like, that is also violence. My job, every day I commit violence at my job because I have to pay my bills and they are telling me to do things that screw over poor people. So I do it every single day. So it's just like, where do you draw those lines? And I get that's kind of an extreme example, but that's something I struggle with. Katie?
Yeah, I had 3 points. So like my first point was what surprised me was like the information about like ROTC or whatever. And like ROTC was just like a regular thing in high school. Like it was just like joining a football team or joining band. But I can also say like I went to a pretty like affluent high school in Orlando. So like the high school I went to like really wasn't considered poor. So I probably don't have the same experience as far as like what like military recruitment looked like. But I can also say like for myself, military was never like something I aspired to. So it's kind of funny hearing people like say that, because like I always felt like military would be specifically beneficial in terms of like paying for college. Like that was like always the thing that military was. Like you go to military and do your 4 years or however many years you want, and then you go to school. So like that was really like the only thing that I seen the military as. And it's kind of funny like having like the knowledge I had when I was growing up, and then like seeing how like sometimes like the military was like in like this end all be all for some people or whatever. And then like the second point was like sometimes I have like this duality with like patriotism, but also like understanding like where I stand within this country, because like it's definitely like fuck the US. Like I hate this country because of what it did to people that look like me, or what it does continuously does to people like me. But also this is the only place I know. So it's also like I definitely love the US because like this is my country. This is where I'm from. Like I don't know nothing else. It's like, I don't know, like sometimes I have that battle with me. Like, is it bad to like, like love the country I am in when I don't know nothing else? Like, like a lot of times people like, let's leave the US, and it's like, but why am I going to leave the US to go to Canada or the UK and get the same treatment just in somebody else's country when I go here for free? You know what I'm saying? And then like the third point was, I also like battle this within myself too. Like sometimes like I feel like sometimes like I definitely feel like we should support veterans, but sometimes I feel like there's like this idea that you should automatically support veterans, and it's just like, how are you going to make regular civilians support veterans when like systematically the US doesn't do that? And like I always hated that, because like you telling us to support these people when you didn't support these people, specifically like black vets. When black vets went to war, like, and they came back, they're still being called niggas. They weren't even getting their GI bills. So it's like, how are you gonna like? How do I support that in these people? Because like, by me, at the end of the day, like I definitely love vet. I think anybody who chose to serve, in that way. But to add to this, I also feel like the military propaganda is always showing like combat. And it's like a lot of people that go to war, or a lot of people that go join the military, don't even see like actual combat. And I love that take that I think Adrienne, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, that you had made about how like people join the nurse corps or whatever. Like now we see like a lot of people. I feel like it's more prominent now that we see a lot of people who join the military was like, yeah, I'm getting deployed, but like I'm also not over there fighting per se. Like I'm just on a military base in another country, like consuming resources that, we don't even need to be occupied in this country because there's literally nothing going on. Like a friend of mine, he just came back from Spain. He was deployed to Spain for 3-4 weeks, and all he did was sit on base.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think, it's kind of similar, I'm glad we did this workshop because it's kind of similar to the way a lot of us are taught to think about police. Like one of our members of RJC actually did a ride along with police a few years back and talked about how dull and uneventful it was. But yet if you watch TV, it looks like they're out there stopping the bad guy every day. And yes, I mean, we live in a world where there's so much nuance. We can't do the either or. So yes, is there a time where a cop does stop someone who's actually doing something really terrible? Of course it happens. Of course it happens. Is there a time where, as far as the military, it's so complicated because of all the propaganda, but it's just never so cut and dry. And I think a lot of people, Katie, feel that that incongruency with patriotism and like loving the country and things like that, especially like you said, marginalized people of any type of background that have presently or historically dealt with any of it. And it's interesting how much this influences our day-to-day. As far as like what are methods of demilitarization and anti-war efforts that have been effective, I'm really not sure historically how it looks on that end. I wonder if anyone else could chime in, but I was thinking about something that came to mind when I saw that question was obviously in our current time with the social justice work we're doing now, there's a lot of mirroring to the 60s and 70s. And a lot of people will hear me talk about, it's like we're in our 60s and 70s, and I'm not looking forward to our Reagan era, which may have just happened, or maybe it hasn't happened and we're about to get it. I'm scared to find out. But there was a time for a while where anti-war was pretty popular thought. And a lot of people, you know, Jane Fonda, for example, actress Jane Fonda, still to this day is ostracized by people because of that photo she took that people said was anti-American. I can remember hearing stories about her doing, you know, meet and greets and veterans spitting in her face and everyone's cheering about it, just because how dare she not support our troops. But at the time, during that war, there was actually a large number of people opposing that war. And now we're kind of in a place where post 9/11, I mean, I hate saying this because it's true, but I don't think I've lived very long or at all without war, because there was the Gulf War in the 90s. I can remember seeing all that. And there was 9/11, which of course we saw that war in Afghanistan and what that went to in 20 years. So demilitarization, I think it's going to be stuff like this. I think it's going to be workshops like this. I think it's going to be groups like Adrienne's group that, for lack of a better word, it challenges the scapegoat a little bit, because when as a non-veteran and someone who's not raised by veterans or directly impacted by the struggles of veterans, it's so easy to just shut me up and say, well, you don't care about it. Like, look at all these people they did for that. Then when you have a veteran stepping in and saying, well, actually, you know, I served and this is what I thought and this is what it really was, I think veterans can really tie into helping us learn new things. And this is why I also don't believe in shutting out veterans and treating them like they are inherently bad people because they join something that is awful. Because again, I wake up every morning and I go somewhere that maybe not be dropping bombs on anyone, but you know, it's a corporation that's profiting and exploiting people, and my job is to screw poor people over. So, which, you know, has been myself with my own company, ironically. So that's just stuff I think about. Katie, did you have your hand up again, or?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on the last point that you said. I agree. I think that's very like shitty for people to like blame vets for doing whatever they have to do, because I mean, like for some people, as like stated in the PowerPoint, like it's survival. Like this is what I'm gonna do in place of like benefiting the people that's coming after me or my family, right? Like, you know, like specifically for benefits, like whether it's healthcare, whether it's education or things like that. Like this is something I had to do. And also like not everybody that is a part of the military is directly a part of like US like imperialistic measures or whatever the case that may be. And I also want to say, I don't specifically know what methods, efforts have been effective, but I think like just changing a narrative of what the US military is like is very imperialistic. And I feel like a lot of people think it's like reactive instead of proactive. Like US military is very oppressive, like, and that's the other thing, like I'm glad that I got to like think about this when I was younger. Like I always did not like how we as a country always went over to other people's countries and then try to tell them how to run their country. Like that never rubbed me the right way. And so like understanding that people are now understanding like, bro, like I understand that you want to stop communism. I understand that you want to do X, Y, and Z, but like you're literally dismantling people's governments. And like I feel like the US population, like it's people aren't just smart. People people aren't smart. And like the American people have like this very, like I would say, contradictory like thought process when it comes to like the military. Like they'll see US and other countries and then be like, oh my gosh, like we bombed this country and I'm so sorry for those people. But then on the flip side, be like, yeah, I'm sorry that we bombed their country, but I don't want to accept refugees or anybody seeking asylum. And it's just like, how can you support the military in the efforts to like do whatever they do and they go to these people's country and like bomb stuff and dismantle governments, but also turn your head away when you have made these people who are now refugees seeking asylum. Like people like there was a quote I was actually looking at, like it was like a roundtable talk. It was saying how the U.S. doesn't accept refugees; they make refugees.
That's very true. It's very true. And like you said, we feel sorry people got bombed. We don't want to take refugees, but it's so normalized. It's like walking by houseless people and saying, oh man, that sucks. I mean, some people don't have any empathy at all. I know some people who say some really terrible things. So those people, sometimes I'm like, they may be too far gone. But the people that walk by and they say, oh, well, this sucks. Maybe they'll give $1, whatever. They feel really sad. They'll donate to whatever, Doctors Without Borders or something. Great. But then if you actually talk to them about this stuff, they still don't want to actually see any systemic change. And I think a lot of that is the fear we have. And it probably is true. If the US military disappeared overnight, then we've made a lot of enemies. Things would probably be really bad for us as people living on this land. But so I think that's why we don't really think about, at least for me, just like defund the police. I don't expect tomorrow we're going to not have police, but society hasn't changed at all. I think first we got to build the society we dream of, which starts by gradually defunding the police, gradually defunding the military, building these systems of security and safety. And then eventually we can see a world where police and military are either very minor parts of society or not part of it at all. But it's so hard to imagine right now because it's just like, if I lock my door, I'm not going to leave it unlocked because there are people, and poverty does exist, and there's someone that needs food and they're going to come in and probably get it. And I can't blame them for that. But at the same time, I also don't want to become a victim myself. So it's a paradox. Does anyone else have thoughts on any of these questions? All right. Just to kind of go over who's part of this organization. We are the People's Safety Coalition with Restorative Justice Coalition, which includes Kieran, myself, as well as Sadie and Emily. Tampa's People's Protest, which Tatiana is part of. Tampa Bay Activist Network, amazing group responsible for things like City Council Watch. Tampa Dream Defenders, which Bernice and Diana are big parts of. For Our Future is also Bernice, I think. Black Collective Movement, Katie, you're part of BCM, right?
I am.
Awesome. So Black Collective Movement is out there doing a lot of great mutual aid stuff. And Andrew Joseph Foundation, which I'm on the board of, just for transparency, these are all part of People's Safety Coalition. There may be, and there's also people who are part of it that are not necessarily part of any organization, but PSC has been around since 2020, doing defund the police, refund the community. All these organizations have been around for a number of years. So does anyone have any last thoughts, questions, or comments? Oh, and I will send everybody these slides as well as the video once it's uploaded. It is strongly encouraged that you share this video. And if you share it with someone and they're like defensive or something, that's the people you need to share it with. The people that like, because we can talk about this all day long with ourselves. We've done the work. We need people who, one of the people that I look up to the most in history, Abby Kelly Foster. Don't worry if you've never heard of her, no one ever has. She said, go where you are least wanted, for there you are most needed. So have this conversation with the people at your church. Have it with, just don't give them my address, please. Like, I don't want to be doxxed, but because this does cause a lot of emotions. People get upset at people like us. I mean, having this conversation is on camera and recording it is scary because the tides change, or another, God forbid, another 9/11 thing happens, and they're going to look at it and say, it's people like this that are why this is happening. That is not true. We have to change, like Katie said, change the narrative. Tatiana, Kieran, any last departing thoughts?
I just want to say thank you all for coming out, and Adrienne, your input was really interesting, especially with you as a veteran. So that was really interesting to get your insight and your input on that. So I do want to thank you for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you everyone for being here. And I'm excited that this is the first of what can be many conversations to change the future.